to this network meeting. We're going to go ahead and record. Thank you. Happy New Year to you all. If you feel so inclined, please turn on your cameras. I know it is very early and for some folks very late. So absolutely understand if you are multitasking, you choose not to turn your camera, but this is going to be an open discussion. So the more that we can actually be human and present, thank you for turning on those cameras. That is great. Really, really appreciate it. So I'm not sitting here alone. So welcome. So happy to see you all. We are taking this time for the new year for a bit of time of reflection. Many of us, it's at that time of year where we think about what we've learned, not only from the past year, but in our case, we've really been looking at nearly 3 years of this pandemic and our work together. The political landscape, of course, looks very different than it did a year ago, let alone 3 years ago. And so we decided to have our meeting today to come together to really have a pointed conversation about how our lessons learned and these broader contextual shifts should shape how we work as we move forward and how we can focus together. This network was formed to drive collective advocacy and action on pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response. And as leaders, candidly move on to other priorities, even while this COVID pandemic continues, we're witnessing the cycle of panic and neglect in real time. And our reason for coming together is really clearer than ever as a network. Our challenges are complex and our challenges are connected. So progress requires all of you. It requires a diversity of organizations, it requires a diversity of sectors, stakeholders, and issue lenses in order to ensure that we bring connected solutions to the table and advance them. So to frame our discussion today, I first would like to invite my colleague, Agre Aluso, who's our Pandemic Action Network Africa Director, to join us to kick us off with a few insights just to inform how we must work as we move forward to drive impact. I'll turn it over to Agre.
Thank you very much, Otsam, and Happy New Year, everyone. So I have the pleasure of, just sharing a few thoughts. It's as Autumn has just mentioned, it's been 3 years, and I think it sounds a little bit like history, but not exactly history. How the pandemic hit us is still very clear in our minds. When it was declared the public health emergency of international concern, we really thought that was a moment the world would really come together in solidarity to address this issue, that threatened humanity and did not respect boundaries. We really thought that would be the moment that the Ubuntu spirit of humanity and global solidarity would really, really come to fruition. But far from it, I think what we witnessed is very clear in everybody's mind, that the reactions that followed were inward-looking, self-defeating nationalistic tendencies that quickly morphed into selfish acts of certain countries, rich countries, who had access to the initial stocks of medical countermeasures, really hoarding those essential commodities, and locking everyone else. Africa, for example, was reminded starkly, that they relied heavily, about 99% of their vaccine stocks, are sourced from outside. And in this situation where everybody now was trying to get whatever little of stock of medical countermeasures were there, they had to make peace with being at the back of the queue, and just wait for their turn. Truly, that was a bleak moment for many of us in Africa and the global South, where, we were faced with the prospect of a very protracted and probably the worst impact of pandemic, in the economy, because this really did not just affect health, but it affected all aspects of human life. I think this was a moment when really global solidarity that should have sufficed to help, mitigate the impact of this global threat should have come to life, but we were failed terribly. And in its place, I think we saw feeble attempts to do charitable acts, which in themselves are very limiting and unsustainable, and really truly have failed to deliver the equity agenda. I joined Pandemic Action Network about 3 months ago, October last year, and I think I am convinced that these stark reminders of the predictable cycle of panic and people reverting back to neglect once the signs of normalcy resume, prompted the formation of Pandemic Action Network. We've seen this cycle, it's all too familiar, from Ebola to swine flu to COVID, and back to Ebola. And, we've just seen this very, very disturbing cycle of panic and neglect. And therefore, as we move into 2023, I really think Pandemic Action Network, drawing its strength from its membership, will continue and should continue to expand its role as a space for solidarity and co-creation, underpinned by the reality that has been so vividly illuminated by COVID pandemic, that a threat anywhere can be a threat everywhere. And therefore, the Pandemic Action Network space creates a space that brings into focus global perspectives, while also remaining vigilant on issues and areas of neglect or areas that have been neglected and that require affirmative policy action and advocacy that should see those policies to be realized. I also think that going into 2023, Pandemic Action Network, creates and really brings into to our reality the opportunity to keep maintaining the spotlight. The public health issues, challenges are connected globally, and we need to work collaboratively to explore solutions, for our shared challenges. And lastly, I think that Pandemic Action Network should continue in its role of creating and maintaining spaces that help us maintain, and sustain the spotlight on the equity agenda, enabling us to bring our shared experiences across the globe and help us share our vision for equity agenda in the pandemic preparedness and response in the coming year. Thank you very much. I think I'll pause there.
Thanks so much, Agre. Excellent framing in terms of the context and really the opportunity that we have as we all work together moving forward to make the most of our time together, which is short. And if we're nothing if not ambitious, we're going to use multiple formats for this meeting. We're conscious that there are a lot of folks on the line. We want to capture as much input as possible. So we're going to use a verbal kind of discussion sharing format plus a digital whiteboard or a Jamboard format. So for those of you who want to share, and it's a new year, I encourage folks to try new things. If you're not typically the person who raises your hand, I encourage you to do so. We won't be able to get to everybody, but if you want to share, please raise your digital hand. And we invite everyone on the call to answer our discussion questions in writing, also via a Jamboard, and we'll share the discussion questions and the link for the board in the chat. If you've never used a Jamboard before, just very quick, instructions. You just tap the little sticky note in the toolbar on the left, and it will open up a separate little post-it note. You add your response and you click save, and then you can add additional notes. And for each discussion question on the board, you will see there's a tile for each question. So there's 3 tiles and you can click through. You can change the side or position of your notes, and you'll see that our team will be organizing responses into different themed buckets so that we can go through those. If you're on the mobile app, Google suggests that you tap and expand before writing your response. These are logistics. If you're having trouble with the board, feel free to always drop responses into the chat. But we won't be able to get to all of those today. But we will take everything from today's conversation in terms of the key themes and wrap it up into a summary note that we'll be able to share with all of you after this meeting. And because a lot of people have joined today, and the chat is typically pretty active for our meetings, like I said, we'll do our best to follow along, but we're not going to be able to capture everything and all of the inputs from the chat during the meeting today. So while the Jamboard starts to begin populated, I'd like to open the floor for inputs to the discussion questions, and then we'll turn to the written inputs in the Jamboard, the whiteboard, for about 20 minutes. So for those of you who'd like to speak, Please kindly, put your digital hand up. I will call on you and we'll try to get to as many as possible. I ask that all of you keep your comments to 2 minutes or less in order to allow as many folks to share as possible. And I'm just going to read off the discussion questions quickly so that we're all anchoring kind of our responses in these questions. So the first is reflecting on 2022 and 3 years of the COVID-19 pandemic. What are your lessons learned on how to approach pandemic preparedness, prevention, and response advocacy? That's what PPR stands for. What is working and what trends should inform how we address our collective agenda in 2023? And then the second question is how must we collectively focus to continue driving progress? And then the third question is how can the network support our collective efforts? And feel free, to also chime in with, how your organization or how you personally can support those efforts as well. And don't feel like you have to answer all 3 questions, but those are the prompts that we have to shape this meeting. So if you can take the slides down, I see Sanjush, Lizzie, and Tala all with their hands up. So we'll go to Sanjush first, then Lizzie, then Tala.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sanjush. So I'm a member of Scientists for Labour, which is a group within the UK's Labour Party, which is in the opposition in the UK. So from talking to politicians, 2 of my biggest takeaways have been that one is that focusing on the economic impact of pandemics tends to gain more traction than focusing on the public health impact. I think when we talk about public health, we only draw interest from the health departments, but by talking about the economics, we tend to draw interest from the whole of the party. The other issue is that one stumbling block seems to be that politicians are very interested on the economic return to investment with pandemic preparedness, which is incredibly hard to estimate. And there are very few models out there to inform us on this. So I think one thing going forward would be it would be good to engage with more economists and try to get better estimates of the economic return to investment to help convince politicians that this is worth investing in, even though it's very difficult to model.
Thank you, Sanjush. Lizzie.
Great, thank you. Yeah, sure. So my name is Miss Lizzie. I'm from ENASO. Well, we basically kind of bring together community groups and civil societies. And what we've learned is the key role that community groups actually play, especially when you have to break down information that's coming from, for example, WHO and other development partners. Especially this is what we felt all through COVID-19, and the role of communities, especially in kind of ensuring that this information reaches the last mile, which is the people, and they understand what is going on, is something that we've seen kind of has assisted in them also understanding the current pandemic, which also we've seen is a good lesson learned on future pandemics or whatever other pandemic we're going to face. So what I think is the fact that we've also felt that we've been working in silos, right? And we never actually collectively addressed issues as a whole. With COVID-19, we had to actually put all those differences aside and work together as community groups. And I like the fact that Pandemic Action Network has also seen the need of having regional groups like ENASO and individual community groups in this kind of discussions. So I think that's the step that we really need to continue going on if we are to discuss any other pandemic that is to happen in terms of just being prepared and being better prepared for anything else that might, creep out. Yeah.
Excellent point, Lizzie. And, we know change happens locally and regionally and really value our partnership. Tala, and then Courtney, I see your hand is raised, and then encourage others to raise their digital hands. We want to get as many inputs as possible.
Thank you very much. I'm not camera ready today because I'm traveling, but I wanted to say that I think a positive outcome around the advocacy part is in terms of community-based organizations saying that there's a great need to change the way the funding mechanisms currently exist. And COVAX is a perfect example of not bringing in the right community players at the right time. And I'm wondering if the current trends for 2023 and that this action network could focus on actually getting the funds to community-based organizations rather than contractors or DC-based groups or UK-based groups to kind of do this top-down structure. Because there's been a lot of advocacy around decolonization, ending top-down approaches, ending the language of bottom-up approaches, but looking at the community to take the lead. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tala. Courtney?
Hi,
And
everybody.
then Peter.
I'm Courtney Dusenberry from the Task Force for Global Health here in Atlanta, Georgia, United States. And I just wanted to make two quick suggestions, I guess. The first is that we're working a lot with more conservative legislators, and we find that the term global health security it has a lot of, it resonates quite a bit, even though those of us working in public health for many years may not particularly like that term or feel that it reflects our work in communities. The reality is in our political environment, global health security is the one thing that we have found that is resonating on both sides of the aisle. And the second thing I would say is that to the extent that we can depoliticize global health security or preparedness and really make it something that can be a win for all political parties, I think is helpful. I understand my viewpoint is only reflecting that of the Southern United States, but just wanted to share it. Thank you.
Thank you, Courtney. Peter, then Harjat, then Javier.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Peter. I hope you can hear me, all of you. Happy New Year, everyone. I represent Global Community COVID Board, and the lessons that we learned is that one of the lessons that we learned, of course, some have been mentioned, is about the digital platform and misinformation. We learned that sometimes the digital platform can really have a lot of misinformation that needs to be managed during pandemic. Otherwise, there comes confusion all over across the globe on the tools that are being developed and challenging science across the board. So that are some of the lessons. What worked well is, I would say, the vaccine, how the global bodies came together and how vaccine deliveries worked. It didn't work as perfectly as we anticipated, but of course, with large volumes and also global world, we had the challenges, but the delivery, there was some deliberate effort to deliver the vaccines to all parts of the world and mostly to the people who need it most. As regards to the trend for the agenda for 2023, I think we need to work on the test and treat. We don't have much of the therapeutics coming off. Of course, we have the pipeline being developed, but we are low on that thing, and it should be our agenda for making the enough therapeutics to test and treat communities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. Harjat, then Javier, then Marissa. And I hope that folks are actively populating the Jamboard. And you know, moving forward too, I encourage us to really think about the question of not just, you know, where we focus in terms of priorities, but how we do that as a network together. And not the royal we, but really in practical terms, in terms of what Lizzie was talking about, in terms of community engagement, etc.
Yes. Okay. Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Good. Yes. So thank you so much for having this discussion. I think there has been so many discussions on disseminating learnings and all. So it's a good thing that we are all talking here and trying to consolidate. So that is also one learning, being engaged with ACTE for, you know, the entire period, that we did amazing advocacy, amazing work at global level. But when it came to taking it down or percolating it down to regional and country levels, there were challenges, there were gaps, you know, gaps with gaps with working with so many UN, WHO organizations. Coming to communities was a different ball game. So I think one thing is that now that we are together, how we move ahead, we must ensure that regional and country level political advocacy or political level engagement is supported. Communities are there, but we need support at country level. And second thing, what is long COVID. Slowly we are stopping, the discussions on long COVID. How does it fit in? And it's not a new thing for us. We have all been engaged with HIV and tuberculosis movements and programs. I think just bring out those learnings on, treatment advocacy, treatment adherence. How do you manage post-COVID? How is the long COVID with women, So I think there are so many missing pieces, and those things need to be put together, but also ensuring that everything percolates down to regional community and all, networks together. Thank you.
Thank you for raising long COVID is a really important piece and priority and trend. Javier, Marissa, and Ariel.
Thank you. I think that I probably focus a bit more on the impact at the country community levels. I mean, as we always said during the first 2 years of the pandemic, Ministry of Health turned into the Ministry of COVID. So we see a lot of service interruption, and I think Harriet can provide a lot of examples and other colleagues on different disease and approaches that has been absolutely interrupted. I think one of the lessons we couldn't learn, or one of the evidence we could not provide, apart from anecdotal data, is what was the impact of those services interruption. For the future, if there is a pandemic, we need to notify and have a record on the impact on those communities, especially for the reconstruction and allocations of resources. As Peter mentioned, civil society worked quickly online, and we spent 2 years working on Zoom and bringing the voices from the community. Many vulnerable and marginalized populations turn into social protection. They will be feeding their peers and also participated in the online communication. And again and again, the impact on other diseases and other health programs was significant, and we should continue flag that. And of course, as the first speaker mentioned, we should also learn the difference between the COVID, how the COVID evolved on the so-called South and the so-called North, because that's a lesson we need to learn, and that's something we need to prevent it in the pandemic response in the future. For us, at least in working on different diseases and different health issues and universal health coverage, etc., we are not clear of the future of the pandemic, the preparedness, prevention, and response. There is a lot of some good ideas, but we don't know if in the next pandemic we are right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Javier. Marissa, Ariel, and then Jonah. And then after that point, we may switch over to our board.
Yes, thank you very much. So two things from a scientific perspective that this crisis has really helped us to reach through is to highlight the importance of the dialogue, the constant dialogue between scientists, society, and politics. Although the consensus is there, then we need to find ways and long-term sustainability of this dialogue in peacetime even. And also there is a general consensus that prevention is highly important. So this has been really highlighted, and that's again from the crisis. However, there is a general consensus on that, but in terms of actions, prevention is really forgotten from all the current actions, high-level actions and decisions that are being made. I'm talking about the pandemic treaty, where there is very little on there, and also the funding mechanism, which are not especially targeting prevention actions, which is the most sustainable and low-cost way to prevent the next pandemic. And I'm talking about prevention in two ways. Prevention in a bottom-up approach, so engaging the communities and the local actors in the definition of the health strategies that needs to be implemented because they are at the front line of risk. And also looking for low-cost solution and innovation to prevent the risk of emergence, to ensure not only sustainability of the prevention action, but also autonomy of the country. So we need, I think, collectively to really push forward the prevention agenda at the political level, at the donors level, and in the field. We need to ensure a long-term engagement into prevention in peacetime. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marissa. Ariel, and then Jonah.
Thank you. I'm Ariel Nylander. I'm from the WaterAid, based in their international team. I really have to echo a lot of what Marissa was just saying. I think one of our greatest learnings from the last couple of years, because we're a federated organization and we also work extensively through our country programs, has been the relationships that have been built through our country programs by being on the ground, by being linked in with the front line and those first responders. We've been able to provide, particularly around hand hygiene, various kinds of responsive interventions. And that's really allowed us to build networks with national and regional governments. And those networks are now, as we move into the recovery and sort of something more like BAU phase of the pandemic, we are now able to build on those relationships to do much larger projects and much more preventive projects, looking at how can we prevent or contain spread of potentially infectious pathogens, both in public places, looking at sort of mass hand hygiene facilities and transit hubs, but also really looking quite a lot at water sanitation and hygiene in healthcare facilities to stop spread within healthcare centers. And obviously we know healthcare centers are where people present when new and novel diseases start to spread, and can be enormous hubs of spread if they're not handled correctly. So we're really very engrossed in that prevention side of the work, both in our AMR work, our IPC work, and that sort of ladders all the way up into all kinds of PPR work. So really in 2023, I would say, we're looking to make our voice heard in more high-level fora. So at the moment, we're targeting the WHO Executive Board meeting, and also the next meeting of the International Negotiating Body. We're thinking about how we can make our voice heard so that some of these, the most simple, the most old school, the most in some ways low tech, but incredibly effective approaches to preventing the spread of infection, as well as containing outbreaks and responding to outbreaks when they do occur, preventing them from becoming, going from localized outbreaks through to epidemics and pandemics. How we can ensure that those are not lost from the conversation in amongst the obviously very important discussions around surveillance, which is critical, vaccine technology and diagnostics, which are all critical, but there are these other critical elements that we want to make sure are always mentioned alongside other aspects of pandemic preparedness and response. And I would echo as well the funding aspect we know is a huge issue. That's something we're targeting throughout our WASH and our WASH and health work. More broadly, it's a really challenging landscape at the moment. And in terms of what we're looking to pan for, I think, is really guidance and intelligence about avenues and mechanisms for making our voice heard and staying abreast of these discourses, because we're not as embedded in the PPR space as some of the other actors in the network. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ariel. That was excellent. We're going to go to Jonah and then Femi, but Jonah, before I turn the floor over to you, you know, it's a new year. Sometimes technology doesn't want to wake up, and we've had some technical issues with the JAM board, which we're working to resolve so that we can capture everybody's inputs. But that said, some of the inputs disappeared. So we're going to go ahead with our verbal format, which seems to be working. I encourage others to raise your hand. Let's have as robust of a discussion as possible. We really want to hear your feedback and views, and particularly how this network can really help us advance our priorities. But if you're having challenges, feel free to drop your inputs in the chat as well, and we will capture from all of the different spaces for our summary note. Jonah, over to you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Jonah Cantor, Canada Director and Global Health Lead at Global Citizen. I wanted to play off of the calls, around the issues of funding, and also highlight the kind of realities that I think we face, and maybe others agree, around funding, not just, decisions taken by world leaders and policy decision makers, but funding for advocacy. Because as we head into 2023 now, I have seen, at least from my vantage point, a reduction and concentration of funding across philanthropy and other donors for advocacy related to pandemic PPR. There's a big change happening, and I don't know if it's a kind of chicken and egg thing where, this is a response to, countries around the world wanting to make the decision that COVID is over and to move on, and or the other way around. And I think that, for all of us to continue to make an impact on this, we're not going to be able to drive the kind of funding that's needed for pandemic PPR unless we all have the capacity to advocate. And so I think collectively, this message needs to be shared back out to all of our supporters and to our donors, doubling down to say that we cannot let up. We need this work to be supported and to continue and to be accelerated. PAN is a wonderful organization, and we've Global Citizens been members since the beginning. But I think PAN can't do it alone, and I think if PAN is sort of struggling to basically get a number of its members to off the sides of their desks to try to sign letters, that we'll always do that. But I think if we are all supported in this work, really collectively, that's where I think the impact is going to happen.
Thank you, Jonah. You raise incredibly critical and important points. We've really seen in terms of the funding landscape. I mean, look, like advocacy is always difficult to get support for, but particularly at the local and regional levels. But now when you add the added lens of the pandemic preparedness, prevention and response base on top of that, like the pool is even smaller. And we're seeing a trend in terms of, in a concerning way, a lot of funders, kind of the core folks who have been in this space, moving on to other issues and failing to connect the dots. And our focus is really that, these issues from pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response are not only related to health, but much broader. We've already brought up today how the COVID pandemic has touched on every angle of society in terms of the economic and the social, et cetera. And yet there's a disconnect on the funding side. So thank you for raising that, Femi, and then encourage others to raise their digital hands.
Yeah. Hello.
Hello, welcome.
Yeah, hi. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. What I must say, what happy New Year to everybody, and I must commend the network for a job well done thus far. But I need to speak to some few issues, maybe one or two. One has to do with the issue of access to vaccines in Africa and in some other parts of the world too. The so-called inequality in the pandemic period, it was quite huge, and we need to really work on that to avert that in the future. So the issue of inequality in terms of vaccine and the access is very, very critical, and also the issue of funding availability to the developing countries. I mean, what do we do to support? I mean, what do we do to advocate in terms of reaching out to the donors and see how they can increase their support, and also the issue of data. Data is very critical, and I think it's a very big. It wasn't too present at all in air disease. There is poor data coordination, and many more. So I think we just need to look at all these too in moving forward in the new year. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you, Femi. Stephen, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Happy New Year, colleagues. My name is Stephen Anguga Shikoli. I'm the National Coordinator Network of TB Champions in Kenya. I think my observation in terms of what COVID has done, and in the past 3 years, it was a lesson in terms of preparedness, and it opened up the weak link in our healthcare system. And we felt like we guys that are fighting tuberculosis, majority of our facilities that were used to manage COVID were our TB clinics, and also health workers were put in healthcare workers that used to work in the TB clinic were the ones that were deployed to COVID-19 centers. And we feel like that made that the gain that we have made in tuberculosis go down, because like right now, things have not reverted to normal. And I think moving forward, if we are to prepare for any other pandemic, I think as a country or as a region or as a world global health team, we need to think about how we can engage community to sustain the intervention and to ensure that communities are at the core value, because communities can assist in terms of creating awareness and in terms of ensuring that the right information is reaching the community in terms of prevention, as well as mobilization to access to things like vaccine. When COVID started, accessing vaccine was not easy, but I think now vaccines have been available in countries like Kenya, and we appreciate that. But I think we can do more in terms of the World Health Advocate to ensure that it reaches everybody in terms of information, vaccine, as well as testing. Because if we now give people vaccine and we've not tested them, because majority of our people have not been tested for COVID, but they've received the COVID-19 vaccine, what are we doing? What damage are we doing in future? Are we going to see some strain of resistance when maybe people develop COVID? Those are the angles that I think in this year we need to look forward as a global advocates. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you for raising the important points in terms of the role that communities play, but also that community advocates can play. Samantha, and then Elon.
I just think we need to really drill as much as possible with as many voices as possible the need for broad health system strengthening as a method of pandemic prevention. I think a lot of really strong voices in the high-income countries are pushing to just make sure we have strong surveillance, strong laboratory, ready to be diagnostics. And that's not going to help like global pandemic preparedness. We need to make sure that health systems are strong across all countries and are ready to respond within country before it spreads to other countries in the first place. So just making sure we have a huge number of voices on that, because the most powerful voices are going the other direction. Thanks.
Thank you, Samantha. Elon.
Yeah, thanks everyone. I was just going to add that it's been really good to hear some of the comments from different people on the call today. I think for me, one of the pressing issues would be is that we've seen with the pandemic fund that despite a lot of the like really insightful recommendations and experiences that civil society and communities have to give for building better pandemic preparedness in the future, it was a real, as it continues to be, but it was a real uphill struggle to get those kind of civil society engagement and experience recognized within the fund structures. We're seeing the same problem again with the pandemic accord. It's been quite an uphill struggle to engage, have civil society and communities listen to, and then to have any sort of accountability mechanisms in place to have follow-up for those recommendations. We're seeing a similar challenge with the review of the universal health regulations at WHO. And I think yesterday they've released the proposed mechanism for the high-level meeting on pandemic preparedness in September. And similarly, it's not great in terms of how civil society can be engaged. There's some sort of stakeholder meetings, but nothing really concrete from the ground up. So I think a great way to ensure that a lot of the recommendations people are making can be incorporated and listened to from member states of WHO and other governments is to try and really push to have sort of consistent principles of civil society engagement and leadership in these various PPPR spaces. Because at the moment, it seems just like replicating the same problem over and over again in each space. We have to make the same arguments again and again to try and justify and explain why any kind of future pandemic responses aren't going to be fully successful without these type of learnings and experiences being taken on board.
Thank you, Elon. I think it also gets to, how we think about as a network of how we harness our energy and support each other together, because this, like, it's a long game, and that there's a lot of two steps forward, one step back, one step to the side, like, and I think it can be a challenging and sometimes, if I'm candid, an exhausting process for many of us. And so the fact that we're here 3 years into the pandemic, there's over 100 folks on this call today. I just want to recognize just everyone's staying in this fight and sticking with this so that we can actually see through the impact that we want to see. Estelle, and then Lizzie.
Hi, thank you. Happy New Year, everyone. Super excited to get back to this after an extended maternity leave. So it's really great hearing everyone's perspectives. I think one thing that's really top of mind for me is just because global health security between pandemics has fallen in priority relative to literally everything else going on, with starting with the war in Ukraine and the ripple effects. Something that I'm really thinking through right now is, if we are trying to reach policymakers, what can we do to get constituents who they care about the most, who are voting them in, to care enough to get the policymakers to actually start caring about global health security? And I think a lot of this network is just so rich with the local on the ground work and intelligence from all the CSOs that are part of this amazing network, and how we are able to, like, power some sort of advocacy campaign targeted to the specific policymakers in the different countries that have a say within G7, G20, COP, the high-level PPR meeting of the UN, all of those people that are there at the table making the decision. How do we create some sort of movement that is powered by the rich work that CSOs are doing on the ground? So I think that's somewhere that I think PAN could really drive forward. And then we are all, like, working together using the same messaging, but the advocacy campaigns are different in each localized setting, because, each setting is different, and what gets a policymaker to change or move or whatnot is always different. So that's just my thoughts right now. Thank you.
Estelle, per usual, you put the kind of, like, really big challenge on the table. And this is one that we're keenly conscious of in terms of how do we get people to care? How do we get leaders to move? There was an opinion piece I hope many of you saw from Mark Mellick-Brown at Open Society and Jim O'Neill from Chatham House this week that was really, referring to the poly crisis, but it was really about the poly crisis of political leadership. And this is something that we're keenly aware of, that we have a set of political leaders who are not stepping up to the connected challenges that we're all seeing and that have been raised on this call today. Lizzie, and then Venus.
Great. Mine is just to add up on what the other participants have actually mentioned. And when we're talking about, there are discussions about the next pandemic, which we don't know when it's going to happen. But the global one is feeling like we need to start talking about the next pandemic. But the question is, we have so many lessons that have been documented, a lot of reports over the 3 years period of COVID-19 on what hasn't been working and what needs to be done. But it always stops into, like, a pretty, 100 pages, 50 pages report that has been launched, and then that's it. But I think now that's where Pandemic Action Network kind of comes in. Now you need to make sure that these lessons learned that have been documented means there's an action that has been taken. Like, for example, and what I like is the Global South actually waking up. And now we noticed that there's a lot of vaccine hoarding. We're not getting enough vaccines, or now we're actually having a lot of vaccines being expired, but then we're looking at and we're having discussions on how we can start to manufacture within the African continent. So then that was an issue with an action that has already, been mapped out. So I think with PAN, the main task is what we've learned from COVID-19 and what that really means. What do we need to make sure are in place so that in case another pandemic hits, we're better prepared. So I think that's the main task for you guys. And of course, so more than happy to help with that. Yeah.
Of course, and that is the whole principle of this network of, no one organization, no one sector, no one stakeholder can do this alone. Like, it really takes all of us. And that's what personally inspires me most about the network, is that we can pull on the expertise and really kind of deploy and engage around the world in a way that is meaningful through the network. Venus.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I think for us, I think someone has already mentioned it, but just to emphasize it, maybe we're going to have to look at advocating for health system strengthening, because that, I think COVID-19 has actually exposed the weaknesses in the health system in totality across the continuum of care, be it available of resources, access to services, vulnerable population, gender equity issues, healthcare worker welfare. So I think advocating for health system strengthening will actually go a long way in preparing for future pandemics, because when the systems are strengthened and they are resilient, and then it actually helps. And I think also one of the issues we probably want to consider is the issue of non-communicable diseases, how the vulnerability of people with non-communicable diseases to pandemics in pandemic situations. That's the continuity of essential services, because then there was a problem with immunizations, NCD access to medicines, ARVs. So now we're saying that we're having outbreaks of diseases that we probably were on the way into eliminating. So looking at that as something that should be strengthened as we prepare for pandemics, so that we do not have other outbreaks post the pandemic or within the pandemic when we lose sight of the gains we should have made. I think someone talked about TB. It also falls under that. Thank you.
Thank you, Venus. I'd like to open the floor if there are any other final comments for a moment. And Ade, excellent. And then we will, I'll hand the mic over to Eloise Todd for some closing remarks. So Ade, and then Christine, and then Eloise.
Yeah, thank you so much. Interesting conversation. First and foremost, I would like to say that Pandemic Network has done a great job. It's one of the most comprehensive communities I've seen, and I'm saying this with all humility. Now, the point I really want to raise, a lot of people have talked about the areas of medical countermeasures and health systems. I want to also talk about the workforce. A lot of times we forget that the main people, the main cost of many of these health systems, delivery, access to products is really the health workforce. And I would want us to really pay particular attention to the frontline health workers and their role in ensuring that we are prepared. We saw the news about Uganda's, the end of the Ebola outbreak in Uganda, but I would say that the role of community health workers has really been critical. So in our advocacy, in our work, from the pandemic policies to the treaty, to the fund, and even to general work on health security across board, it's important that the health worker is prioritized, and the health worker is a key actor across board. And I feel that everyone from civil societies to multilateral organizations and bilateral donors, governments need to focus on the health workforce from a pre-service, in-service point of view. And I think this is something that we should really have at the back of our minds in all that we do. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ade. We have a couple additions before we switch over to Eloise. So Christine McNabb, Kiwa Abe, and then Anne, and then we will hold on any further comments, but please feel free to add your inputs into the Jamboard or into the chat, and Eloise Todd will close us up. Christine.
Oh, great. Thanks so much, everyone. Happy New Year to those I haven't spoken to yet. This is such an incredibly rich discussion, and hearing people literally standing outside of health centers in countries, and those of us sitting in sterile offices in northern capitals is fascinating. It just brings to bear the idea that we have global processes happening this year. We have the high-level meeting at the UNGA and probably mid-September. We have the WHO processes, the INB, the IHR, et cetera. I think we're quite good at feeding into those, but there are regional processes also taking place in terms of regional finance, regional agreements, regional plans. So how does this network focus on those? But that brings us then to the national processes, and how do we ensure that your own governments are actually paying attention to your needs, and that your own governments are feeding into the regional processes and the global processes in ways that make sense. So I think layering all of the advocacy at each of those levels is really important. And then focusing also on sort of, there are two broad buckets. One is, how do we end this pandemic emergency? And that's not going to happen until everybody has the tools they need to end it, not once we just get tired of talking about it, which is what we're sort of doing. So listening to people saying, we still need vaccines, we still need therapies, we still need treatments. So I think that's really important to continue to focus on, because this pandemic emergency won't end until that happens. And then the second bucket is, how do we prepare for the next one? So I think being really clear on our objectives and dividing them out, and ensuring that the national, the global, and regional processes kind of fit together. And that's a big task. But the clarity there, I think, will be super important. And thanks again. Really great to hear from everybody today. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. Kiwabe, and then Anne, and then Eloise.
Okay, for me, I'm going to talk about community involvement. Now, as regards the PPR advocacy, community level involvement is very vital. However, during the previous COVID-19 pandemic, the trend lacked appropriate communication platforms and community engagement strategies, such as community organizing, gender transformative approaches, community engagement and communication accountability, risk communication and community engagement. Such platforms and strategies could help to enhance community level involvement, and it is critical to support COVID-19 outbreak. Thank you.
Thank you. Anne.
Hi, Happy New Year. I just wanted to, build off of what Estelle was saying about the need to have public engagement on the bottom-up approach. One of the things that we have been working on at the Global Health Advocacy Incubator is to really build public demand for epidemic preparedness as a way of keeping the political leaders aware and engaged about the need for it. And we have been trying to tap into the election cycles to assure that political leaders elected into office have this on their agenda. And I do think that's a critical piece. There's so much really great work happening globally and regionally, and it needs a lot of pressure consistently. But if the right leaders are not elected into office who have this on their agenda, it's going to be a constant struggle to keep it as a priority. This is definitely needs to be tailored to the local context, because every context is different, but having that real focus on having the public hold their leaders accountable and elect leaders that prioritize PPR, and finding ways to plug PPR into the conversations and networks related to health system strengthening, and UHC is a way to expand and broaden the base of support for PPR. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Eloise, over to you.
Thank you, Autumn, and thank you to the 120 plus people and partners that have joined this call. What a rich discussion, and what a great way to kick off the new year. So I think we've heard a sort of sobering assessment of where we are. We know that we are needing to make the case more strongly than ever not to turn away from these issues. But we also know that we have the evidence base to do so. And we also know that imagine the countries represented on this call, imagine the range of organizations represented on this call. And it's the power of the network that we come back to do some of the things that people were talking about on this call. Taking that last point raised by Christine on doing things regionally. A reminder that we have our regional working groups, for example, on Africa, on Asia, on the EU budget, and in the US. And it is absolutely vital that while we input into those global pieces, we're actually doing the work at the country and the regional level with partners. So that's something we want to do with all of you much more this year, and find ways of partnering and really getting close to those processes and supporting each other in a way that will make change happen. Also, the talks about building the movement, this constituency is fantastic. The people on this call, fantastic. There's also others that we need to bring in more and more. People that really care about what just happened in the last few years, all of us, but those that were really affected by it, maybe people that lost people, maybe people suffering from long COVID or the other effects of the pandemic. We need to think more laterally about how we have our ways into these issues, talking about how to talk to politicians about these. Those are the kind of issues that will be brought up by constituents. And of course, making that economic no-brainer case that we have the evidence, but we do need to package it in such a way that helps all of you when you go to see your policymakers, making that information local. So I think there's a lot of things that we can do which will strengthen the constituency that we have that wants to fight for pandemic prevention and preparedness, but also will help us to go more to where people are. The first couple of years of our existence, we were in a rolling 24/7 news cycle of COVID, and more COVID. So in a sense, that work was done for us, and we could play into that. Now we have to much more take our issues that we're working on and insert them into where the energy is, whether that's in communications terms or whether it's in advocacy terms. And I'm very hopeful for this year as well, for the efforts and the scale at which people are looking to make change happen, whether that's looking at the complete reform of the multilateral development banks and the way in which we deliver finance. We have to make sure that health is in there, pandemic prevention, preparedness and response. But there are these kind of conversations about a bigger kind of change going on that's not just tweaking at the edges. There is more of a reckoning this year on, well, what worked and what didn't, and a much more honest conversation about what equity means. We heard from Agre at the beginning about some of those issues. There's a really big opportunity with a new pandemic countermeasures platform to make equity at the point of at the outset, rather than at the point of distribution of funds or countermeasures. We have to have true equity in a structural way, and that needs to be different going forward. So the key messages are, we know what we have to do. There is a challenge ahead of us to really bring our issues into the conversation. That means going to where people are. It means thinking more laterally about who our constituency is. But most of all, it means keeping connected, keeping working together. And a huge thank you from all of us for everything you do, whether it's on pandemics or other issues. And let's keep thinking about how we can support each other mutually on all of those issues, because everything is ultimately connected, and we will not make progress on fighting pandemics, outbreaks, prevention, preparedness, and being ready for the response unless we tackle a whole range of inequalities. And so huge thank you from all of us to all of you. And let's do this again before too long. It was absolutely cracking. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Have a great evening. And we will see you soon. Cheers.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you and bye.
Bye. Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye. Take care.